Hello and most welcome to 1017. We are presently not far from Hovås, where you and me, Jan, were 1 year ago, but that was later in the year, must have been July. Here it's situated nice, close to a lake, sauna separated, and there we have a house and dead tree. Didn't see that before. This is not connected to the electricity company, so there is solar panel. Well, at least it wasn't connected to this electric system. It could be now, actually. And over there is another extra house. So it's quite massive. It's even a canoe. It's a lovely June day. Still, summer hasn't really come, I'd say. Well, summerish it is anyway. And I will try to emphasize here the discovery that has been made the last couple of weeks. And I've said many times before, what we have here is the composite of all the understanding that has been building up. Quantum mechanics started already 25 years ago for me, and it is still developing to this day, and all I read, studied, discussed, tested, it's still in the turmoil, it's still in the soup doing its work. This fractal complexity, I feel more and more that it has its effects. It gives results. It's not lying there passively, it's not negated. Quantum mechanics cannot be negated because it's not made out of its counter. I will use this abbreviation because this is something I've been repeating way too much. But being defined by a counter, meaning that an illicit division shows what existence or presence are, so they get interconnected in an all unlawful way, and that puts in a limitation at the very outset, and it's in this random limitation, or I would actually get into the details there. It's a level of randomness. It's a bit clumsy to just call it random. Level of randomness enters into the picture, to the equation. Previously I just said randomness. Now I would say it's a level of randomness. Some cases it's more accurate, in some cases it's less accurate, but it's an unnecessary randomness to make the randomness bigger. This is maybe the most important, that it's unnecessary. Doesn't have to be there. So this is how it goes. Think about a circle. That could be a nice metaphor. Think about a circle, and that the circle gets divided. You don't know how, and you're using the other part. So instead of using the whole circle for every instance that you're supposed to do something, we can imagine that this circle is a piece of equipment that could be used as a whole or in parts. But preemptively dividing it from the beginning makes the division inevitably random to some degree. Might be fitting better in some cases, it might be fitting worse in some cases. And that I would call a level of randomness. And especially since it's introduced from the beginning, you don't know yourself what will the level of randomness be from the outtake. That is hidden from understanding from the very beginning. So it's not something that can be reduced away or made to not show its face. It's still there. It's doing its job, so to speak, by itself, without you being in on the game, helping out in any way. It will be working still. Similar random cut is made between inside and outside. There is an inside and there is an outside. But making a preemptive random cut somewhere in between where you don't know where, and you're not even aware that is being done, makes you have to play on a much smaller surface. It's diminished already from the outset. This could actually be helpful in understanding the necessity for paraconsistent logic. One way of looking at it is that paraconsistent logic becomes necessary once the cut is done. So, seeing from inside after the cut is made, situated in time somewhere before the after the construction of classical logic, the real classical logic of Aristotle, the Aristotelian logic, and the event of paraconsistent logic, you feel that you need to take in contradictions. But to a certain extent, that is not completely right. Contradictions were made by the random cut from the very beginning. The a priori happening before time cut made you having to sort of fuse the contradictions. But they were not contradictions from the very, very beginning in the amnesia. Not contradiction as such. This is another completely different take on contradictions. I don't know if you like it, but that's another way of explaining this connection. And as I mentioned before, different explanation can make up for an understanding. You go about the things in different ways, and in the end you will reach a greater understanding. This is what I'm hoping for, and that's the motive for doing different explanations. This might not be possible to grasp right on, but this second take is that what looks like contradictions, or get the name contradiction, or the experience of contradiction, is established in the a priori state. And that a priori state I usually explain in a time scale going back to almost pre-antiquity. But another way of looking at it is just to saying it's before and not really pointing to a specific time. That's another way of looking at it. Not a necessary way, but it could be helpful. And now we're just talking about before and not specifically somewhere in Historia, as Martin Heidegger would have put it. It is just a before. I got this idea yesterday when we went further into the particular and the big and the distinct and the less distinct or undistinct, the general and the nominal. Another way of looking at it is the scale indifference, and to say that the normal is absolutely dependent on the universal and vice versa. This is not a view that was expounded before the event of quantum mechanics. It was an impossibility. Actually, it was not even thought of. So there is a new possibility after quantum mechanics. It is a going to the before of establishment, before of a random cut, that makes us having to join or fuse or make contradictions complementary. Since also this random cut makes time itself random, it is a justification for this second approach I present now. There is an introduction of randomness in time as well when we do the cut to create present. When we say that present is not what is absent, we are cutting up even more of what is available. To go into the before, we can gain real sequencing. And my first usual approach, speaking about pre-antiquity, has a weakness, and that is one of the factors. The time of pre-antiquity is in the after cut time. It's, well, you could say, classical time. But all things will have to become pre-cut. You could say that everything has to be quantum mechanical, also time itself. And since that will take more of an understanding, because now all of a sudden all points are loose. It seems very soft at the very beginning. It feels that you're not standing on anything. It has been a proxy or some sort of thing to lean on to help the understanding. But might be the time now to get rid of the idea of what happened in antiquity, because that is still having a feature of binding everything into one singular preempted cut in time. Maybe it could be compared to swimming. See that pre-antiquity timescale that I introduced before is a little bit like those swimming tools that we got when we were little, around our arms and belly, to help us float so we could learn how to swim. Now it's time maybe to get rid of those helping things, because they no longer help, they hinder the development, because it makes swimming more cumbersome and not as fluid. This can also be moved over to knowledge itself. Not to understand how much knowledge we have is a problem in itself. To have an idea that we know everything, it's damaging to knowledge. By saying we know everything or a great portion of everything, we undermine our own position. We make a devaluation of knowledge. That makes for an inflation. It's a little bit like you want to know where to put your foot if you walk in a marshland and you don't establish where are the firm points and where are the loose points. You will lose your grip and you will fall in or put your foot so deep that you get really wet. this is the same. Although it sounds so good from the outset, I know everything, it's really handicapping. And there is an underlying assumption in the idea that you know everything or a great portion of everything, and that is that knowledge itself, it's not real. In a real world, obviously, you only know a portion of the world. In a radical otherness of the world, you can't know everything because you haven't experienced everything, and we don't even know the limits to what can be experienced. This is actually a little bit of going back to Ashishtalela and Samkhya, Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti is the realness of the world, and that is absolutely where all qualities are, everything that can be known. And classical physics ignores real qualities just because they won't let the subject in on the business. The subject is still doing its work. By ignoring it, we don't know what we know, and our focal setting gets off. It won't be accurate anymore. This is a more specific take on the previously mentioned theory of everything, Sabine Hossenfelder's idea, and also the idea of Stephen Hawking. It is very problematic in itself. It becomes a happenstantial, non-shared reality, the simulacra that Ian McGilchrist describes, or the less extended life world of Michael Ashcroft. A loosening of space that makes it unreal, and the body will therefore not be localized. We think we gain something in this take on Michael Ashcroft by seeing the body as something that is not non-space, not non-emptiness. And by thinking of the body as substantial in this first take, in this first sequence, will diminish its possibility. It will lock it in idea of space that is very limiting from the very outset. And that could be actually the very reason for that we as human beings seem fit to sort of limit ourselves, divide ourselves, make our smaller. This is similar to have an imaginatory friend called Morgan. He can do whatever games you want, you can suggest what you want, he won't complain. But you will lose out on the complexity of reality. It won't be any fun games. You will notice that. Otherwise, we will stick to our imaginary friends all our lives. They do make for a really boring game, in the long run anyway. The difference is, in the first example, neither the inner side nor the outer side is real. And then you get stranded in this imaginary state where you start to assume you can make up everything, or rather that making up things is the only thing you can do, and that there actually is no reality to existence. Therefore there can be no knowledge, neither can there be any insight to understand. This was the conclusion of Friedrich Nietzsche in many of his books, specifically Gay Science. We always end into trouble when we want to see both sides as real, both the inside and the outside. We feel in our hearts and on the outside this is something we cannot sort of accept both. it's either one or the other. And you see here how the preset rules tells you what you can do or not to do, because that was already established. Now, I think that could actually be a good starting point to sort of question this assumption. Why, in what way, or rather how does the limitation occur? Because that rule seems to be on the outside and the inside at the very same time. So the opposition to accepting both seem to be on both sides. So the opposition, the argument, so to speak, or the opposition or the impossibility of having both inside and outside at the same time, seem for some odd reason to be situated both in the inside and outside. So the opposition or the counter-argument against having both the cookie and eating cookie seem to be oddly situated both on the subjective side and the objective side. Isn't that a riddle that could be solved? That is odd in itself. And I think there is sufficient reason to question. So this constant choosing we do might not be something we had to limit thinking to, an unnecessary limitation, and a limitation that, oddly enough, and this feels more and more odd to me, was set from the beginning. Isn't that odd when you really think about it? We always assume, well, we found this out, this is from reality, therefore it's a good thing. But yes, okay, I agree to some extent, but there's another problem. It seemed to be present at the very same time on the subjective side and on the objective side. Otherwise, if it were only one, it would be completely subjective and therefore on good grounds to ignore it. If it were to be only objective, it wouldn't be this eternal rule. It would be on the Purusha part that is bound to change, and also under the victim on how you know it. Because all that is out there is not known by me, but this is immediately known by everyone. And therefore the counter-argument doesn't follow its own rules. It seems to be present directly on both the objective side and on the subjective side, and that's the only possibility to explain why it's shared by everyone. It is shared by everyone. Quantum mechanics is a hit in the eye. Paraconsistent logic is not that much easier to accept. Usually the reason for people accepting paraconsistent logic is that the alternative is so horrific explosion that everything is allowed, makes people go into paraconsistent logic. And this is exactly what's happening now, since explosion, thanks to computer calculations, make it even more obvious that explosion is a bad thing. It undermines everything. But that does not mean that people willingly and in good humor accept the other alternative of including both sides on the same thing at once. let me put some wood to this fire that I started. It's an article coming from the Atlantic on the mystery and wonder of extended cognition. And the title is "You Think with the World, Not Just Your Brain." As always, a horror film managed to express the idea before scientists ever could, and in better, more visceral terms. The television screen, the haunting image of Brian Oblivion, tells us in David Cronenberg's 1983 classics Videodrome, is the retina of the mind's eye. Therefore, the television screen is part of the physical structure of the brain. So far, so much media theory. Second-hand McLuhan, third-hand Baudrillard. It's what happens next that's interesting. Our hero, wilting under the caustic nihilism of the video age, finds that strange things start happening, not to his mind but his body. A howling cavern opens up in his stomach, rimmed by grisly pulsing labial folds. It eats weapons. His hand sprouts metallic screws, driving into his wrists, locking his gun into a hand that swells into a grotesque of formless and seeping flesh. He is told to kill, and he kills. It is not that his mind has been invaded, it just exists beyond itself. It now contains endless shelves of videotapes. This is somehow, obscurely, us. This monstrous body is our own. Among philosophers, biologists, and cognitive scientists, this nightmare is an exciting new field of study, known as embodied or extended cognition. Broadly, the theory that what we think of as brain processes can take place outside the brain. In some cases, this isn't a particularly radical idea. The octopus, for instance, has a bizarre and miraculous mind, sometimes inside its brain, sometimes extending beyond its sucker-tipped trails. Neurons are spread through its body. The creature has more of them in its arms than in its brain itself. It's possible that each arm might be, to some extent, an independently thinking creature, all of which are collapsed into an octopian superconsciousness in time of danger. Embodied cognition tells us that we are all more octopus-like than we realize. Our minds are not like floating conceptual I imagined by Descartes. We're always thinking with and inseparable from our bodies. The body codes how the brain works, more than the brain controls the body. When we walk, whether taking a pleasant afternoon stroll, or storming off in tears, or trying to sneak into a stranger's house late at night, with intention that seem to have exploded into our minds from some distant elsewhere, the brain might be choosing where each foot lands, but the way in which it does so is always constrained by the shape of our legs. We can't ever stalk like a creature with triple joint legs, or sulk in the dejected crawl of a millipede, or stride with the giraffe's airy ganglion deference. The way in which the brain approaches the task of walking is already coded by the physical layout of the body, and as such, wouldn't it make sense to think of the body as being part of our decision-making apparatus? The mind is not simply the brain, as a generation of biological reductionists, clearing out the old wreckage of what had once been the soul, once insisted. It's not a kind of software being run on logical process unity of the brain. It's bigger and richer and grosser, and in every sense it has joints and sinews. The rarefied rational mind sweats and shits. This body, this mound of eventually rotting flesh, is really you. That's embodied cognition. Extended cognition is strange. Many years ago, when I found myself standing on the roof of a tall building, or on a platform on the London Underground, or by the banks of the river, I would feel a strange urge to throw myself off. Not because I was miserable, or because I particularly wanted at the moment to die. It was like an itch, an obsessive-compulsive tick, the deep gravitational hunger of the death drive. I would visualize myself falling stupidly and fatally for no reason other than to indulge in the most pointless destruction. I would almost savor the feeling of being hemmed in on all sides by ordinary life, commuters on the platform, tourists gawping at the Thames, and at the same time, right on the edge of the void, the domain of gods or nothingness or both. Maybe you felt the same urge. But I don't get it anymore. These days I still sometimes feel that cold, vertiginous breath down my neck. But it's not my body I want to throw down into the void. It's my phone. Isn't the phone now part of the physical structure of the brain? '98, 15 years after Videodrome, the philosophers and cognitive scientists Andy Clark and David J. Chalmers finally made sense of what was happening in their landmark paper, The Extended Mind. The mind, they argue, has no reason to stop at the edges of the body, hemmed in by skin, flapping open, closed with mouths and anuses. Recent studies have added weight to their provocation. It has been shown that spiders can use their webs to process and store information, essentially outsourcing mental processes to physical structures. Why is it, Clark and Chalmers ask, that mentally rearranging Scrabble ties is considered part of action rather than part of thought? When we jot something down, like a shopping list maybe, on a piece of paper, aren't we in effect remembering it outside of our heads? Most of all, isn't language itself something that always external to the individual mind? We can't invent our own private language, as Wittgenstein showed in his philosophical investigations. We can invent our own words for things, but only as substitutes for words that already exist. It is impossible to make the incommunicable meaningful. Language sits hazy in the world, as symbolic and intersubjective as ether, but at the same time it forms the substance of our own thought and the structure of our understanding. Isn't language thinking for us? This is not entirely a new idea. Plato, in his Phaedrus, is hesitant or even afraid of writing, precisely because it's kind of artificial memory, a hypomnesis. Writing for Plato is a pharmakon, a remedy for forgetfulness. But if taken too strong, a dose it becomes a poison. A person no longer remembers things for themselves. It's the text that remembers, with unholy autonomy. The same criticism are now commonly made of smartphones. Not much changes. Most of all, though, a theory similar to extended cognition is present in the work of Hegel and his descendants, and in particular Marx. In the dialectical tradition, the hermetic and self-contained Cartesian consciousness is impossible. We only become conscious in and through the world and its history. Marx, in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, describes the process of unalienated labor in familiar terms. The object of labor is, therefore, the objectification of man's species life, for he contemplates himself in a world that he has created. Work without ownership or scarcity is a kind of play. You always turning the exterior world into something else, something more responsive to your needs and your being. In a liberated future, the world of objects can be an externalization of our own consciousness. It can be a true home for humanity because it is already ourselves, but not yet. First we have to overthrow capitalism. In the 20th century, Theodor Adorno picks up his theme. The separation between subject and object exists. I am not the world around me. In fact, for the most part, I'm terrified by it, while it's monstrously indifferent to me. But this is a result of a coercive historical process. It wasn't always this way. It doesn't have to be forever. The difference is that, according to the theories of extended cognition, the separation is already over and always was. That subject and object are united right now. But not entirely. Extended cognition promises to rip up the idea of a mind that lives only in the furrows of the brain, but it doesn't always follow through. Cognition is extended, outsourced, leaking from cranial slime into the material world, but like an octopus's tentacle, it can always dart back in. There are stranger and more dangerous possibility. Take the grocery list. For Clark and Chalmers, it's brain process. Information storage and retrieval, offloaded onto a piece of paper. But by whom? In Limited Incorporated, Jacques Derrida uses the same object to construct a very different interpretation. At the very moment I make a shopping list, he writes, I know that it will only be a list if it implies my absence, if it already detaches itself from me in order to function beyond my present act, and if it is utilizable at another time, in the absence of my being present now. End of quote. The list will still do its cognitive work if you not currently read it. The list will still do its work if you are dead. If we can accept that the grocery list in some way is thinking, is the part of a mental apparatus that remains lodged in the human brain really so central? The thought capacity of objects is indifferent to whichever a bit of brain is plugged into it. A war memorial remembers its list of the dead for us, in the same way that a scrap of paper remembers milk, and it keeps remembering long after the weeds have grown and the rest of the world has tumbled past caring. In Molloy, Samuel Beckett's strange and gorgeous thicket of a novel, a long section sees the titular character sheltering by a beach, trying to work out a system for passing sucking stones between his various pockets and his mouth, so that he never sucks on the same stone twice. Fantastic methods are devised, new ways of ordering the world, stones moving around by force across the ordered and Ptolemaic universe of his coat. Stones moving singly in the postmodern disorder. It is Molly who is thinking here, or is it the system, the dynamic complex of pockets and stone? This passage has attracted a fair amount of attention from philosophers, who tend to see it as either a parody of logical system in general, or a form of thought beyond reason. Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus see in it the model of a new kind of reasoning, schizoid, embodied and diffuse. Molloy's circulation of pebbles in a complete machine, one which the mouth too plays a role as a stone sucking machine. We used to think of active machines as digital machines. When we talk about the possibility that unliving things might think, we mean computers. We might be very short-sighted indeed. All the processes we attribute to brains and computers alone might fill the world, in the same way that legs codes the program of walking. Unknown information is inscribed in the patterns of grains of sand, as the wind tosses them on an empty beach. The frenetic interconnections of the internet and the spoken world are thrumming in a field of grass. The thinking machine thinks, it has its processes and its functions, and the world of inert objects might think too, in a slow and strange ways, which we can only borrow for a moment, and which disappears again in what sounds like silence. And to this, of course, I want to add the artifact. Think about the fude. Fude is the strange bamboo brush used in calligraphy of the East. It's an extension of the mind, and it does several things at the very same time. It's the best instrument to further the balance of the hand and to make thinking more precise, according to Confucius and many other Chinese thinkers. In the exact movement of the pen, there is no support from anything, and that means that your hand has utmost liberty of going in what else direction it wants to. And in the flow of the hand, we have knowledge. They have a good understanding that the flow of the hand is knowledge. That pattern carries everything. It's a movement that can carry loads more than the idea of the brain as a CPU or something similar. The fractality of the hand carry all the information, the intention, and also the direction. And thus they train their hand, and by training a hand with an artifact, their bodies also becomes more balanced. And it could also be the heart consciousness that becomes progressively more connected to the outer world, or heading towards the outer world. This is the production of hand movements, and the hand movements carry the knowledge. I also think it is amazing they are copying still to this day 3,000-year-old movements, and understand these movements carry all the knowledge of the person who wrote them. And I think this is the most amazing artifact. It can do what no computer can do in the world, and is yet to be discovered of Western Hemisphere. I hope that comes soon, because it's too way of a brilliant thing to be let down. It's an amazing way into something beautiful. And with a panoramic view, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. As you can see, it's becoming progressively bluish. The sun is slowly coming down, although it's still early.